A mega project unlike any other one that brought together over 150 countries across the world. Airports, motorways, and seaports were promised. Dreams of creating the next Dubai, the next Singapore, were shown to struggling nations. But today, those very dreams lie shattered. Many of these grand projects remain incomplete, buried under mountains of debt or reduced to ruins. This was China's most ambitious global undertaking, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Once hailed as the project of the century, it is now being called a geopolitical disaster, one that has cost the world's poorest nations the most. So, what went wrong? Why is a superpower like China now facing criticism and suspicion from every corner of the globe? It all began in 2013 when Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, better known as the BRI. The plan was introduced as the largest development project of the century. Its vision was to build a modern Silk Road, a vast network of railways, highways, and ports connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. China's mission, at least on paper, was to lift underdeveloped nations onto the path of progress and, in doing so, establish itself as a global leader. This grand vision stunned the world. More than 140 countries expressed interest, and many poor nations rushed to borrow money from China. Within years, Beijing had invested over $1.2 trillion into the BRI, but this funding was not given as aid. It came in the form of loans. Loans that Western banks and even the IMF had refused to issue, calling them too risky. It wasn't long before the true nature of the BRI began to surface. It was not just an infrastructure project, it was China's geopolitical and economic agenda. The truth was, China's industrial capacity had grown far beyond its own needs. Every year, millions of engineers were graduating, but finding jobs for them within China was becoming increasingly difficult. That's when Beijing devised a new plan: export its surplus workforce, expand its industrial reach, and at the same time, increase its geopolitical influence. The strategy was simple: lend money to poorer nations for BRI projects, then use China's own industries and manpower to build them. In this way, the loans would fuel China's economy while giving the appearance of helping others. But the biggest controversy surrounding the Belt and Road Initiative lies in what's known as debt trap diplomacy. In other words, China extended such massive loans to poor countries that repayment was nearly impossible. And when these nations failed to pay back, they were forced to hand over their land or critical infrastructure to China. The most striking example of this can be found in Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan leaders were sold a dream that by building a brand new port on the Indian Ocean, their nation could become a regional trade hub just like Dubai. But there was a problem. Sri Lanka already had the Colombo port, a fully functional transshipment hub where cargo from massive vessels was transferred onto smaller ships. China lured Sri Lanka with the promise of building a brand new deep-sea port along one of the busiest shipping routes in the world, stretching from the Strait of Malacca to the Suez Canal. This port would be known as the Hambantota port. When Sri Lanka agreed to take a $1.3 billion loan from China to build it, Beijing began laying out its terms one by one. The first condition: only Chinese firms would be allowed to construct the port. The loans themselves carried relatively low interest rates. But if a country failed to repay, China retained the power to seize control of the project. That is exactly what happened in Sri Lanka. The Hambantota port was built, but it never became commercially viable. Feasibility studies had already indicated that there was no real need for such a port in that location. In fact, in some years, only 30 to 40 ships made a stopover there. With the port failing to generate meaningful revenue, loan repayment quickly became a major issue. By 2017, the situation had escalated to the point where Sri Lanka was forced to hand over the port to a Chinese state-owned company on a 99-year lease. Today, the entire revenue stream from Hambantota Port flows directly to China. Sri Lanka, in many ways, lost a part of its sovereignty. But Sri Lanka was not the only country caught in this trap. In Africa, the small nation of Zambia, whose economy relies almost entirely on copper exports, also fell victim. Its leaders dreamed of modernizing the economy, and with the help of Chinese loans, they launched a series of ambitious projects. The narrative they were sold was that loans from the IMF and Western countries came with tough conditions, while Chinese loans seemed easier. What they overlooked, however, were the hidden clauses, stipulations that allowed China to seize assets if the loans went unpaid. The price of those dreams turned out to be extremely high. By 2020, a staggering 43% of Zambia's total external debt was owed to China alone. And in November 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic brought trade and tourism to a halt and global demand for copper collapsed, Zambia officially defaulted on its debt. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China also financed several projects that turned out to be completely useless. These are often called white elephant projects, grand and majestic to look at, but with no real practical benefit. Take Montenegro, for example, a small country in Europe. In 2014, it borrowed $1 billion from China to construct the Bar-Bulhare Highway. But the planning was so poor that, after cutting through mountains and beginning construction, the entire loan was consumed in building just a single short section. Today, only 41 kilometers of road exist, leading to nowhere. This tiny stretch of highway cost so much that it shook the entire Montenegrin economy. Now, Montenegro's debt has climbed to more than 80% of its GDP, forcing the country to seek help from the IMF and the European Union. Meanwhile, in Sri Lanka, right next to the Hambantota port, another ambitious project was launched, an airport built in hopes of driving development in the region. The Matala Rajapaksa International Airport was constructed at a cost of $200 million, financed once again through loans from China, but the plan quickly collapsed. No airlines were interested, and no passengers came. Today, this airport is known as the world's emptiest airport because so few flights ever arrive here. At times, elephants and other wild animals are even seen wandering across its runways. But Sri Lanka is not alone. On the west coast of South America lies Ecuador, another small nation caught in the Belt and Road trap. To solve its energy crisis, Ecuador partnered with China to construct the massive Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam, a project worth $2.6 billion. But during construction, Chinese contractors ignored quality standards, and it later emerged that officials had been bribed to push the project through. The result is that today, more than 17,000 cracks cover the walls of the dam. At any moment, this project could collapse, posing not just an economic disaster, but also a massive human and environmental crisis. And then, it was Pakistan's turn. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, was launched as a $60 billion initiative. Pakistan placed high hopes on CPEC, believing it would bring electricity, jobs, and development. But most of the projects were either delayed or failed altogether. In Gwadar, local communities staged repeated protests over the lack of water, electricity, and against China's growing control. The promises of jobs were never fulfilled, while Pakistan's debt burden continued to rise. Today, Gwadar Port, once managed by Pakistan's own authority, has been handed over to China. A staggering 91% of its revenues go to Chinese operators, leaving only 9% for Pakistan. The Belt and Road Initiative faced its biggest shock when Italy, the only G7 country to have joined, announced its withdrawal. Unlike other nations, China had not given Italy direct cash loans, but instead signed memorandums of understanding for promised investments and trade deals. But most of those projects never materialized, and the economic benefits for Italy were minimal. That is why Italy later called its participation a big mistake and withdrew from the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy was not alone. Countries such as Malaysia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Nepal also either canceled or renegotiated several BRI projects after realizing the risks involved. Seeing these failures, both the United States and Europe launched their own alternative initiatives. Programs like PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and Europe's Global Gateway promise transparent terms and low-interest loans, helping countries avoid China's debt trap. But as a result, China and Russia have drawn closer together. After Russia found itself isolated following the war in Ukraine, it sought to strengthen ties with China through the Belt and Road Initiative. This is creating a new geopolitical axis, one that poses a fresh challenge to American dominance. After 10 years and trillions of dollars spent, the Belt and Road Initiative is now regarded as one of modern history's greatest foreign policy failures. China, however, is trying to rebrand it as BRI-2, focusing on digital infrastructure, green energy, and sustainable projects. But unlike before, the world is no longer willing to believe in promises alone. Countries today will only accept projects that deliver real economic benefits, not ones that simply add to their debt burden. The big question is, while so many countries suffered losses through BRI, did China itself actually benefit? In reality, China did not achieve exactly what it wanted. Its original goal was to expand control and influence around the world. Instead, the Belt and Road Initiative gave China a new label, debt trap diplomacy. Because of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's own economy has slowed down. On top of that, China is now burdened with the responsibility of recovering hundreds of billions of dollars in loans, while also managing the projects it has seized control of. On the other hand, through BRI, China has managed to secure direct or indirect stakes in over 100 ports across the world. This gives China a powerful edge in supporting its export-driven economy and expanding its strategic maritime presence. If the entire BRI network is ever completed, it will become the longest road, rail, and sea connection, stretching all the way from Asia to Europe, covering nearly 65% of the world's population. We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and share it, and we truly appreciate all your kind comments and support. See you again in the next exciting video.